So this paper is about Mary Midgley and Mary Midgley's moral philosophy, and one, I think, important and specific aspect of her philosophy, which is her attempt to provide a complex account of human wickedness and vices. Now, of course, moral issues were very central to the wartime quartet. Murdoch, Midgley, Anscombe, and Foote all had a lot to say about moral issues, including very constructive things like helping in the revival of virtue ethics, and also very critical things like their rejections of certain kinds of emotivism and criticisms of certain tendencies in early 20th century analytical ethics. But I want to suggest that one thing that was very distinctive about Mary's work was her emphasis on what we might call the dark sides of human moral life, wickedness, evil, corruption, and vices. So in her 1984 book, Wickedness, for instance, she calls attention to what she calls the natural evils, by which she means the set of vices that belong to us as a species, those which are natural to our species and which beset humankind. And Mary discusses the dark sides in at least two ways. First, she has lots to say about them theoretically, for example, by drawing on work in evolutionary theory and ethology to provide an account of our wickedness, which is sensitive to concerns about human nature. But she's also interested in the dark sides of human life in more applied contexts. And of course, in particular, in relation to our abuse and exploitation of animals. So think of her book, Animals and Why They Matter, which was quite controversial at the time for suggesting that animals did indeed matter morally and that our mistreatment of them is a moral debacle. And I think that this attention to the dark sides of moral life was very welcome at the time, and I think it's still very important now. Even today, we still have an interest in the virtues, but the philosophical project that explores them is called virtue ethics, when really, of course, it should be called something else, something more like character ethics or character theory, because virtues and excellences can only ever be, as it were, half the story about our moral life. There is another side, the dark side of human life, which includes vices and wickedness. And the focus on flourishing, the good life, and all these happy dimensions of moral life, I think has unfortunately tended to occlude or to disguise vices and corruption related phenomena. We've spent, as it were, too long looking at the bright sides of human moral life, and it's time that we should look a little more closely and a little more sustainedly at the dark sides. Now, of course, the neglect is not total. There are plenty of people who write excellent things upon moral and epistemic vices. There is a flourishing discipline of vice epistemology, populated by very virtuous people, some of them in the room. So there's not total neglect to the vices. But relative to the enormous and intense effort that we give to the virtues, there is, it seems to me, a certain imbalance. And especially when we think about these moral projects in the context of other historical projects for exploring human moral character. So if you look, for instance, through the history of, say, the Buddhist and the Christian traditions, you find enormous resources for the identification and the analysis and the classification and the correction of our sins, defilements, cankers, imperfections, and the whole variety of other moral, spiritual, and epistemic failings that many Christian and Buddhist theorists see as contaminating human life. So put in historical context, it's strange that we don't say more about the vices. And certainly, if we look at the contemporary state of humankind, you'd think there's a much more complex story to tell about the vices. And this is where I think Mary Midgley comes in. I think that Mary was very good at not just thinking about the vices, but theorizing them. So I want to suggest to you that she has a vice theory, and even better than that, she has a very good vice theory, one that we should take seriously and one that would help contemporary character theorists to think more systematically and more holistically about the complexities of human moral life. Now, what do I mean by a good vice theory? Well, I think there are at least five desiderata for a good vice theory, five features that a vice theory ought to have if we're to take it seriously as a good one. And a lot of the inspiration here comes from a fantastic paper by Robin Dillon called Critical Character Theory, which I think is one of the best things written about the vices in recent philosophy. So the first four desiderata concern what I see as important features of the vices that need to be emphasized, affirmed, and explored. First, there is, I think, the sheer variety of the vices. I mean, if you were to sit down with a pen and paper and draw up a list of human vices, you would end up with a very, very, very long list. You know, not only are there many different kinds of vices, including moral vices, epistemic vices, spiritual vices, political vices, aesthetic vices, there's just an enormous number of them. I mean, somewhere on my computer, I have a list of I think of about 650 vices that philosophers in different traditions have identified. And the list of these can be very extensive: arrogance, cruelty, selfishness, hubris, insouciance, laziness, self-indulgence, narcissism, etc., 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 including whole varieties of vices that have only recently come to be identified through the work of vice theorists. So there are both the familiar vices like arrogance and cruelty and dogmatism, but also, if you like, esoteric vices that have only been identified by specialist work by scholars. Vices that if they were described to you, you would say, oh, yes, that's a thing, but that you weren't consciously thinking about. So there is the sheer variety of vices that needs to be accommodated. It's not like there's only a few, there's an awful lot of them. Even if the tendency in many traditions has been to spotlight a certain number of them, like the 7 deadly sins, or in Buddhism, the 3 poisons, in a way that can disguise the rest of them. Second, a good vice theory needs to emphasize the power of the vices, the power that they have over the people who possess them. So one of the reasons that vices are interesting is that they're not minor irritants, something like kind of moral itches and scratches that we have to deal with. The vices have enormous power over us. They can distort in very powerful ways our perceptions, our feelings, our moods, our interactions with other people, and they can, of course, often drive us to do the most appalling things to ourselves and to other people, and also to non-human animals and the natural world. So the vices have remarkable power over people. They can drive us into the worst excesses of evil and wickedness. And of course, people struggle with their vices, or they struggle against them. It's not as if the work of overcoming your vices is a matter of recognizing them and then snapping your fingers and they're gone. It takes enormous, often constant effort to struggle against our vices, to try to limit their strength, intensity, and severity. So the sheer power of the vices needs to be identified. Third desiderata is the prevalence of the vices. One interesting feature of the vices is in most human societies, they're not confined to small, unusual groups of, if you like, vicious misfits. The vices are pretty prevalent within societies. There may be a few virtuous exemplars who are remarkably vice-free, but these people aren't very common. Most people, I take it, have at least a certain range of vices, which I don't intend as an insult to anyone here. But most people will have a range of vices of different strengths and of different intensities. But vices are pretty prevalent within human populations. It's not just a small number of us who have them. They are prevalent within the human species. And that in itself would stand for explanation. The vices are not confined to a few unusual moral monsters or psychopaths or moral deviants. The deviants and the moral psychopaths might have extreme versions of the vices, but none of us, if you like, get off scot-free. And a fourth desideratum for a good vice theory is to explain the persistence of the vices, and not just their persistence within the life of individual people. I mean, there are some vices I'd like to think I've overcome in my 40 years, but many other vices that I continue to struggle with today and that I expect will be companions until my last days. So there is a persistence of vices within a lifetime. But I mean here something more like the persistence of vices across human history. So one anecdotal example of this, I teach a course on Buddhist philosophy. And one of the things that we do is we go through the Buddha's very long discourses where he lists our vices and failings, or what the Buddha calls our cankers, taints, and defilements. And one of my students going through one of these lists very recently sort of raised their hand and said, when did he write this list? And I said, well, 2,500 years ago, more or less. And the student said, isn't it very depressing that none of them has gone extinct? Greed, avarice, selfishness, cruelty, dishonesty, exploitation of others. The student said these vices have been knocking around for 2.5 millennia, and none of them have really disappeared. And they thought this was an extremely distressing fact, that none of the vices have gone extinct. I mean, there are some vice concepts that have become extinct, but if you look at some of the ancient lists of the vices, they're just as familiar today as they were thousands of years ago. So the sheer persistence of the vices within human societies, their stubbornness, their entrenchedness would call out for explanation. So those are the first 4 desiderata for a good vice theory. A good vice theory should explain the variety, the power, the persistence, and the prevalence of vices within human societies. There's also a 5th desideratum I'll mention because it's important to Mary's account. A good vice theory should be self-reflectively critical in the sense that it should be alert to its own assumptions, its own methods, and it should take special care to ensure that the ways of thinking about the vices are fit for purpose. So one of the ways to be self-reflectively critical is you challenge assumptions that you've inherited about the nature of the vices. Two examples. First, it's often presupposed, I'm told wrongly, that Aristotle taught a two vices dogma, that for every one virtue, there are two vices, one of excess, one of deficiency. Now, my Aristotle colleague friends tell me that's actually not true. His view is much more complex. But what has become entrenched, I think, is the idea that for every one virtue, there are two vices, the excess and the deficiency vices. Now, I think that's false because there are many more vices on either side. So vice epistemologists, for instance, have identified a whole range of different vices, many, many more than the corresponding virtues. So the two vices dogma is false. There are just many, many more vices. But the entrenchment of the dogma has had a serious negative consequence. It's taught us to systematically undercount the number of vices by telling us to stop counting at two. So you take your virtue, once you have one vice of excess and one vice of deficiency, you stop counting, even if there were other vices that you would find if you carried on counting. So the two vices dogma is something that should be challenged. Another is what's sometimes been called the inversion thesis, the idea that really the vices are just the shadows or the opposites or the inversions of the virtues. So once you get an account of a virtue, you get an account of the vice, the corresponding vices for free. You just flip it or invert it. So Robert Merrihew Adams has defended a version of this thesis, and its historical origins probably go back at least to Augustine and the privative theory of evil. But the inversion thesis, I think, is deeply problematic because it disguises the fact that the vices themselves have a psychological and a moral reality that means that they're more than just the inversions or the shadows of the vices. They deserve study in their own right. So a good vice theory should also be self-reflectively critical about inherited assumptions about the vices. And I think that Mary's vice theory is a good one because it fulfills at least these 5 desiderata. There might be others, and if you think there are, I'd be happy to know in the Q&A. But the claims I want to make then is that Mary's vice theory fulfills these desiderata. And the reason that her account is a good vice theory is first, she has a very rich conception of human nature. Second, she uses what Benjamin Lipscomb calls an ethological approach to the study of vices, and I'll explain that later. And also, it's very characteristic of Mary as a person and also as a thinker that she constantly emphasizes and wants us to admit a deep, pervasive discrepancy between human ideals and human conduct. And I want to develop that thought at the very end of the paper when I end with a gently critical suggestions that Mary needs to say a little bit more about the social dynamics of vices, and also that she might want to think a little more carefully about her relationship to misanthropy. So those are the claims I want to make. Mary is a very good vice theorist and one who should be taken seriously by contemporary people interested in virtues and vices. And I'll start with human nature, and this is section 2. So human nature was a central theme throughout much of Mary's career, starting with her first book, Beast and Man, The Roots of Human Nature. Various reasons that Mary was interested in human nature, other than the fact it was a big topic in the 70s and continues to be. But in particular, she wanted to rescue the concept from various extremes. So one extreme was just denial that there is any human nature. The other was, in a sense, the opposite, the insistence on a very rigid, deterministic conception of human nature. And then other claims, for instance, that there is a human nature, but it's totally plastic. It could be completely transformed. Mary saw all of these as exaggerations and distortions. And if you knew her, and if you know her work, Mary always disliked exaggerations and distortions. As she says in a later book, too many theories of human nature are guilty of a combination of one-sidedness, universal pretension, and sensationalism, which are all red flags to Mary Midgley. And many philosophers of science and biology, like John Dupre, have echoed these complaints. Now, I won't here go through the wholeness of her account of human nature because we would not be done before the new year. But 2 general themes that she always wants to emphasize. First is the animality of human beings. So think of the famous opening line of Beast and Man, where she says that human beings are and have never been anything but animals. And second, her emphasis on the complexity of human nature. So she wants to emphasize, we have to be understood as evolved creatures. Our animality is not some kind of minor fact about ourselves that's worth mentioning by way of curiosity. The fact that we've evolved from certain animal creatures fundamentally shapes the kinds of moral beings that we are and that we can be. And this means that any serious moral theory has to attend to the realities of our evolved biological nature. And also, this nature, as a product of a complex, messy process of biological cultural evolution, is just fantastically complex. And as Mary always emphasized, so much of moral life is concerned with the complexities of what we are. So this means that, in a sense, she doesn't have our theory of human nature. Instead, there's a constant emphasis upon the complexity and the messiness of human nature. Says there isn't a single structured thing called human nature. Instead, what we do have is a very messy assemblage of different motives, desires, needs, emotions, what she calls open instincts and behavioral tendencies. And these can be combined in different ways. Some of these are congruent with one another, others are clashing. Some of these will be very, very deeply rooted in what we are. Others will kind of float to the surface and then disappear. So our nature is extremely complex and unsystematic. And a lot of the work of philosophy, and in particular of moral philosophy, is helping us to understand and manage the complexities and conflicts that human nature makes possible. And this has been very well described in recent work by Midgley scholars like Greg McIlwain and Ellie Robson. And the different motives and desires that make up human nature are themselves very complex. For example, they vary in specificity. There might be a general desire for companionship that is very, very general, but it can take ultra-specific forms. For example, in experiences of love, when what we desire is companionship with a specific person. Some of these motivations, desires, and needs are very determinate with definite objects. Others are much more open-ended and they can latch on to different things. Some are very intense and some are very weak. Some of these motives might overpower us if they're activated, as many forms of fear do. Others may be less so. And some of them are clearly much more central to human life than others. For example, the instinct of self-preservation or the desire to protect one's children. So human nature is a complex, unstable, dynamic structure. And a lot of the work of life is trying to maintain some kind of harmony, wholeness, and integration, to cite some of her favorite terms. But the connection to the vice theory comes with, if you like, the messiness of human nature. So as Mary says in Wickedness, human nature is highly ambivalent and it's full of conflicts, and it presents us constantly with a moral dialectic. And so many of the moral struggles, dilemmas, anxieties that we experience flow from human nature. And then, of course, from the complexities of our relationships with other people, and then with the complexities of the social world that we are in. So human nature for Mary is the necessary background to moral life. And I think that this relates to a vice theory in at least two ways. The first is what Mary called the natural history of moral evil. She emphasizes that if we want to understand the variety of human vices and the phenomena of wickedness, we have to understand these in relation to our inherited animal needs, drives, temptations, tendencies, and conflicts. She says many of our vices do reflect features of our social circumstances. For example, we live within social communities with hierarchies and unequal distributions of power. Of course, that makes possible certain vices, but so many of the ambiguities and complexities of what we are flow from our natures. So one of the ways that she develops this theme is to point out that certain varieties of bad conduct and certain kinds of vices will only be tempting and psychologically possible for creatures like us. So one very obvious fact about human beings, we are social creatures. And at the same time, we're also antisocial creatures. We desire connection with others of our kind. Most of us prefer to live in some way with other members of our species. But at the same time, we can be very herd-like. We enjoy dominating others. We desire social contact, but then we will often spoil them. We can be greedy and selfish and exploitative and insensitive towards others. Those vices are only possible for social creatures. Only social creatures can have social vices. And as Mary speculates at one point, suppose that human beings had evolved to be largely solitary creatures who only come together periodically to exchange news or reproduce. Those creatures would have very, very different vices. They would be solitary creatures, so wouldn't need the social virtues or vices. But he says, for creatures like us, with our sensuous material needs, we are susceptible to certain kinds of vices. Philippa Foot makes a similar point when she emphasizes that we are, among other things, very sensuous creatures. We have various material, sensual, and sexual desires and appetites, and this makes us susceptible to the sensuous vices like greed and lasciviousness. those vices are built into creatures like us. Or more carefully, the possibility of those vices is built into creatures like us. One of the ways that Mary also thinks about this is to imagine what she calls paradisal beings. So creatures who are very unlike us in terms of their physical and psychological constitution. For example, creatures who maybe through gift of evolution have immaculate emotional self-control. They never experience the excesses of emotion. Creatures, I don't know, like Spock from Star Trek, perhaps. Now he says creatures like that just couldn't have certain vices. For example, they could never become rageful or vengeful. They could never be overwhelmed by their emotions. Those vices would not be possible for that kind of creature. Or imagine creatures who didn't have very strong sexual appetites. They just couldn't have certain vices like sexual indulgence or concupiscence. The vices would not be possible for them. And as Mary kind of very wryly remarks, we might sometimes envy these creatures for their immunity to the vices, but then we'd have to think about everything that those creatures lack, including the pleasures of self-indulgence. So she says there is a natural history of moral evil, and if we want to understand our vices, we have to understand them in relation to the kinds of creatures that we are. And this is related to a second feature of her thinking about human nature, which Benjamin Lipscomb calls the ethological imperative. So ethological here in the sense that the term is used in the sciences to describe the study of animal behavior, particularly through observation and participation. Now, for Lipscomb, one feature of Mary's moral methodology is that she wants us to be ethological in our approach to human beings. So if you want to understand human moral life, you have to observe people's actual moral behavior. We have to think structurally and integratively about the species we are studying. So if you want to understand, say, the varieties of honesty and dishonesty, you can't do this in abstraction by sitting down and just thinking about it. You have to, as it were, go out there into the wild or into a coffee shop and observe how people use truth and untruth in their everyday encounters. You need dense, detailed observations, maybe informed by kinds of participation in human life, to understand how we do truth and how we do untruth. And of course, there are plenty of moral philosophers who do this, and also plenty of other people who are, if you like, moral commentators on humankind. I think one of the best examples is the Duc de la Rochefoucauld, famously cynical observations on human beings, but also often very lucid, insightful remarks. I mean, his most famous remark is, many virtues are but vices disguised, because many people know that they can conceal their vices as virtues and that there are social advantages to doing this. And if you read through Mary's works, there are constant, dense, detailed descriptions about people's everyday vice behavior. For example, the fact that we often use vices in various ways. We deploy them tactically and strategically for the sake of our own interests. For example, deploying our arrogance in certain situations to advance our own interests, or using cruelty and selfishness to put others down to get them out of the way so they're no longer competitors to us. Or the fact that we often enjoy many of our vices. For example, people often enjoy being cruel and mean. You see this in a lot of people's everyday humor. People often enjoy being selfish and self-indulgent, and not just very wicked people. We clearly have very complex emotional relations to our vices. Some incur guilt, others incur certain kinds of pleasure or satisfaction. People will use their vices as everyday tools to navigate the social world, even when they recognize that they don't. And as Mary said, this has to be factored into any serious account of the psychology and the appraisal of vices. For example, the fact that many people experience the sheer satisfaction of being drastic, which she identifies amusingly as a fault of actually many philosophers and scientists who are very prone to make very grand, dramatic, dogmatic claims, not because the evidence and the arguments support them, but because there's a pleasure in being drastic. There is a pleasure in being shocking and provocative. And it's these kinds of observations on human everyday moral behavior that Mary wants to use to build an account of the vices. And this is not to say that there's no role for study of Aristotle and Confucius, and it's not to say that we should give up the attempt to produce abstract systematic accounts. It's that all of these things should be factored into vice theorizing, study of the classic texts, looking at psychology and ethology, everyday observations of human behavior, trying to develop systematic accounts, but then not being trapped within an overly tidy systematic account. But the crucial thing that lies in the background of all of this is that the vices have to be understood in relation to human nature. As Mary says again and again, the vices belong to us. They are natural to our species. They are not aberrations. They are not mysteries. And this is a fact that she thinks is disguised by bad metaphysical stories like Manichaeism, which depicted good and evil as metaphysical forces generating and sustaining the world, but also by certain bad myths. For example, the myth of the fall. Now, the myth of the fall is complex, and I am not a theologian, but one of the standard ways that people interpret the myth of the fall and what happened in Genesis is that originally human beings were not just viceless, but vice-free. And then the whole business with the snake, and then human beings are spoiled forever. Now, one implication of that story is that the vices were not originally a natural part of the kinds of creatures we are. They were artificially induced later on. But as Mary warns, that will drastically misguide us when we think about the vices, because we will think about them as aberrations that don't belong to us and that in principle could be removed. And this is something that she perceives in certain kinds of transhumanism. So human nature must be central to vice theorizing. So what then does she actually say about the vices? So she puts this complex, messy account of human nature in the background. But what does she say vices are? And this is section 3. Well, she defines vices very, very traditionally. She says they are defects of our qualities. Elsewhere, she gives a slightly different definition. She says the vices represent failures to live as we are capable of living. But it seems to me that she's not so much interested in first-order moral theorizing. For example, she doesn't sit down and then produce a definition of vices and then check it against counterexamples. I think she's much more interested in the ethological business of describing vices and how they manifest in human life. Unlike a lot of vice theorists, she likes giving lots of lists. So the vices that she mentions in different books include spite, resentment, cruelty, meanness, hatred, arrogance, perversity, self-dramatization, envy, cowardice, sloth, ingratitude. And she gives these lists and then she gives examples from literature and everyday life. She points out that many of these vices occur in specific contexts, like our mistreatment of animals. But again, what she wants to do, I think, is to take tidy, everyday ways of thinking about the vices and then to complicate them. And in particular, she wants to complicate our understanding of the psychological and the motivational dimensions of vices, but also at the same time, complicate our thinking about why the vices are good or bad. In a certain sense, she wants to kind of spoil the party by saying that the aim of many philosophers is to produce neat accounts of the vices, but we want to kind of smudge this over with a lot of messy detail. And so the two things that she always emphasizes, the complexity of vice and the dynamics of vice. Now, with the complexity, it's very important to Mary that there is a tendency to try to think about the vices in terms of a limited number, maybe just one motivation that defines the vice. But as she says, this just won't do. Most of the vices involve a very complex plurality of different motives. Many of them, of course, by definition, will be negative, but vices also include certain neutral motivations, ones that are neither good nor bad, but also, perhaps surprisingly, certain positive motivations. So she wants to reject the idea that the vices should be defined exclusively in terms of negative motivations. She says they're much too messy for that. She says many vices include motivations that we should recognize and endorse. For instance, she agrees that there are many varieties of pride and that many of these are vicious. But she says even the worst forms of pride do contain a motivation that we should endorse, namely the longing to be honored. She says that longing makes sense for social creatures like us, whose fortunes partly depend upon the esteem and the respect of others. So even in the worst forms of the vice of pride, there is a longing to be honored and recognized and esteemed by our fellows. And that should be factored into the evaluation of pride. Likewise, she has quite a lot to say about the vices of domination, the vices that drive us to seek and to maintain control over others, including other humans and other animals. But she says domination itself has many, many motivations. It's not just about cruelty or power, and she criticizes, for example, Foucault for making too much of power. She says there are many other very animal motivations that should serve to explain our dominativeness. For example, like many animals, we are highly protective of ourselves and of those we love. Protectiveness, she says, might be a good or a bad motivation depending on what you're protecting and how and at what cost. But protectiveness is a part of lots of vices. Likewise, like many animals, we're also often very territorial. I mean, not just in the literal sense that animals are, but we have a certain territory, social and intellectual, a space that we regard as ours, and a space that we want to protect insofar as we feel safe inside it. And therefore, we become suspicious and resentful of those who might intrude into our territory. Also, she says, domination is driven by a natural concern for control. She says the desire for control over other people is not in itself problematic. Again, it depends upon what and who you want to control and why, and what the effects of your control is on the personal thing that you're controlling. But a desire for control in itself isn't a bad thing, and in fact, it will be a precondition of a sustainable life. And she also mentions other more general tendencies. For example, she says, if you spend any time with young children, for instance, she says we often get bored by security, and we tend to look for excitement by seeking danger. We like to, as it were, knock things over, cause trouble, make a ruckus. We desire security and stability and then often get bored by it and then want to do something else. We also have a tendency to become irritated by certain sorts of intrusions, by disruptions into our habits, by changes to the social environment that we've become accustomed to. Says all of these things need to be factored into an appraisal of the vices. And she warns us that we should always reject any account of a vice which depicts it in terms of maybe just one or a few negative motivations. She says the story will always be much more complex than that. Likewise, Mary also wants to emphasize the dynamics of vices. She says we can learn a lot by thinking about a single vice in abstraction from the other vices and virtues. But at a certain point of analysis, we have to think about how the vices interact with one another, how they interact holistically and in interrelation with one another. And this is because, among other things, some vices, she thinks, play special structural roles in human life. These are what David Cooper calls the necessary vices, vices that have become necessary to the structure of the kinds of lives that we live, such that if you remove the vices, you collapse the structure of the life. For example, Mary has interesting things to say about the vices of vanity. She says one of the things that surely makes vanity very interesting is that it's the vice that makes admitting all of your other vices unbearable, because the vain person, of course, wants to think very well of themselves. They want to imagine themselves as morally unblemished characters. And yet your vices, of course, can be construed as faults or defects. And so the vice of vanity has a special relation to the others. It's the vice that makes all your other vices unbearable to admit and is therefore a significant obstacle to very honest moral self-reform. Likewise, she says, the vices of hatred are also highly dynamic because they involve a complex structure of interacting drives, motivations, and feelings, which is part of what makes hatred so dangerous. So hatred includes strong resentment, kinds of fear and anger, but also the tendency for the hated person to become a symbol of some hated element in life, in which case the vice has now become tangled up with memories, social perception, imagination, anticipations of the future. And wickedness itself, she says, as a phenomena, is a complex compound. It's not a vice in itself. It's something more like a dynamic interaction of a whole set of virtues and vices. So wickedness for Mary includes, depending on its form, aggressiveness, greed, love, curiosity, the sheer uncritical force of habit, a fear of strangeness, the absence of other motivations. Wickedness, she says, is a complex dynamic product of a whole system of virtues and vices and other neutral traits as well. Which is why I think it was very unfair of Bernard Williams in his review of the book to say, but Midgley doesn't give us an account of what wickedness is. Her reply would be, it's far too complex and conditional phenomena to give you an account of what it is. That's just not the sort of phenomena that it is. And the craving for a simple, well-defined account is one of the vices that she would criticize. So what Mary then emphasizes the complexity and the dynamics of the vices, the fact that they can't really be studied in isolation from one another. They have to be thought about in terms of their emotional, psychological complexity, their interaction with social environments, and their rootedness in human nature. And of course, that makes vice theory really, really hard. I mean, vice theory is very hard anyway, but what Mary wants to do is to insist on a complex, often quite smudged picture where there's no easy accounts of what the vices are. Maybe the best that we can get is dense, detailed descriptions of lots of different vices and kind of vignettes about how the vices might emerge and function. But that, she says, is the price we have to pay for taking seriously the complexities of human viciousness. There's also a further problem, unfortunately, which is again is a distinctive feature of Mary's vice theory. She was very aware that the reality and the complexity and the dynamics of vices are often concealed from us, consciously or not, by what she calls distancing devices. And this is section 4, myopia. Now, I mentioned that Mary thought that a good vice theory is self-reflectively critical. And again, that's one of the big themes of the wartime quartet's work. They were very sensitive to and very critical of defects and limitations in inherited ways of thinking about moral issues. And Mary thinks that something similar here is true about the vices. Says there's a whole set of tendencies that we seem to have picked up, which distort our ability to think seriously about the vices. And these distancing devices, as she calls them, tend to obstruct appreciation of the reality, the diversity, the power, prevalence, and persistence of the vices. Some of these distancing devices are some assumptions that we picked up, like theoretical dogmas, certain habits of thought, maybe certain ideologies. But whatever form they take, their collective effect is to try to distort thinking about the vices. And I think in her work, she describes many of these. I'm just going to mention 4. And I'll mention the first 3 very quickly. The first, a distancing device for the vices, is pathologization, the tendency to try to reduce moral failings to mental disorders or kinds of madness, therefore removing them from the domain of moral evaluation and placing them into a psychological or medical domain. So medicalization of the vices would also be an example of pathologization. Second is dramatization. So when we think about the vices, we can often tend to imagine them in their most extreme forms. So, when we imagine a vicious person, we imagine some sort of raging, snorting moral monster, the sort you might only find in certain kinds of literature. And this might be useful because, of course, imagining vices in their most extreme forms can bring certain features into sharp relief. However, it will encourage the tendency to imagine that vices are only confined to almost like supernaturally evil people of the kind you only find in fiction, or the kind you only used to find in fiction. But this in itself will distort our thinking. It's an exaggeration or a dramatization of vices. And it conceals the reality of what Montaigne calls the ordinary vices. The fact that a lot of cruelty, selfishness, and self-indulgence is not dramatic, it's ordinary, almost strangely modest. But in that case, it disguises the gradations of vice. And another distancing device is simplification. So taking a vice which has complex psychological, emotional, and behavioral forms and reducing it down to its simplest elements, maybe to one motivation or just a few motivations. And again, says Mary, the temptation to simplify is very intelligible. We have a lot to do and we don't have much time to do it. And there can be advantages to simplification. Simplifying is not a vice in itself, but it will be a vice if the simplification is, as it were, one way. If you take something complex and simplify it for the purpose of analysis, but then don't make the return movement and restore the complexity. So each of these distancing devices will distort our understanding of the vices, and sometimes in ways that are self-serving and offer false comfort. For example, it is very reassuring to think that vices are just mental defects. They're very rare. They're actually very simple. They don't occur very often. Those are comforting thoughts, but of course, they're also illusions. But of course, they're also very popular. So you see these distancing devices on full display in the writings of some of the modern philanthropists, people like Rutger Bregman, who in his book, Humankind, A Hopeful History, insists that human beings deep down are very, very good. We're very generous, kind, pro-social. In his cutesy remark, Homo sapiens are really homo puppies. We're creatures striving to be good. That's the kind of story that people like to be told. But it partly depends upon a defective conception of human nature, and also, I think, remarkable obliviousness to the realities of what the human moral world is actually like. So it's not just that we have the distancing devices, we're very tempted to use them, and we're very attracted to people who do use them, partly because we really want good moral news, because the world is in short supply of it. And again, these concerns about the distancing devices have been echoed by other vice theorists. For example, by feminist vice theorists who've pointed out the invidious tendency to gender some of the vices, to presuppose that certain vices are the exclusive possession of women or other marginalized groups, as part of what Robin Dillon calls a politics of character assessment. So we have to scrape vice theorying free of misogynistic tendencies, racist assumptions, and kinds of pathologization, dramatization, and simplification. And likewise, the concept of human nature is abused in all sorts of ways. But I think the distancing device that really interested Mary is what we might call myopia. So she was very often critical of the tendency to use a single moral framework. And this, she says, is going to distort our vision of the vices, because any moral framework, however complex, can only light up a certain range of our failings. So as Mary says, if you use one moral framework, then selective concern becomes concentrated wholly on one particular field of iniquity. Maybe, for example, varieties of greed, but in a way that leaves all of the others in the shadows. One example of this was Mary's criticisms in Animals and Why They Matter of the fixation in animal ethics on issues of justice. Now, this, she says, monopolizes attention, because if you can only see things through a lens of justice and injustice, then eventually meanness, envy, cowardice, sloth, and all the other vices will be reduced to unjust acts. The only way that you can normatively appraise things is as distinct species of injustice. And maybe those vices do have relations to injustice, but they're not varieties of injustice. And if you insist on seeing them as unjust acts, you're going to efface all of their distinctiveness. So we need to use a plurality of different frameworks. In fact, in the worst cases, some moral frameworks might occlude the role of vices altogether. For example, several critics like David Cooper, Rosalind Hursthouse, have criticized the reliance in animal ethics on moral rights and status approaches to thinking about our treatment of animals. And one common complaint is that if you think that the wrongs of our treatment of animals is that we don't respect their rights and status, then really you're explaining mistreatment of animals in terms of cognitive failings. You don't know certain things about animals. You don't recognize implications. You don't see inconsistencies in your beliefs. The problem with this is that it treats as cognitive failings what are really moral failings. Surely what's wrong with most of our treatment of animals is a moral failing, like greed, selfishness, willingness to exploit vulnerable creatures. Those are moral failings, but they are disguised if they're treated as cognitive failings. And of course, that will be convenient to most people. So I take it most people would rather be accused of cognitive failings than moral vices. I mean, Zaki Zamir, for example, makes this point when he describes an episode from his youth where he'd rather bloodily killed a chicken. And he says very honestly, this wasn't due to my speciesism or not understanding something about the chicken status. It was, he says, because I was, quote, one of the standard stone-hearted products of a society in which a living animal is merely a transition phase on the way to becoming food. He said what was wrong with my mistreatment of a chicken was not a cognitive defect or a lack of understanding or an inconsistent set of beliefs. It was that I was callous, uncaring, and willing to kill things for pleasure. So Mary wants to say we can only do good vice theorizing then if we can remove or challenge or dismantle these and other distancing devices. And I think that her work, of course, is pretty successful at this. Okay, last 5 minutes. Now, I've been very positive about Mary's vice theory. I think it's a very good vice theory. I think it can accommodate the variety, power, prevalence, and persistence of human vices and failings. And I think that's due to her rich account of human nature. But I think there are two things that she underplays, two things that she can make more of. So one is the social dynamics of vice, and the other is her connection to misanthropy. Now, when it comes to the social dynamics of vice, I do think that Mary often understated the extent to which the social world is, in a technical sense of this term, corrupting. So I've argued elsewhere that something is corrupting if it tends to encourage and facilitate the development and the exercise of vices. Because I take it our vices are pretty dynamic things. Vices can grow, change, they can mutate, they can become more or less powerful, more or less intense. And many features of the social world can be corrupting in this sense. The social world is full of temptations, inducements, opportunities to vice, rewards for being vicious, punishments for being virtuous. I think the social world is deeply corrupting, and I think that this is important to any vice theory, to understand that the complexities of vice partly reflect the corrupting realities of the world. And Mary, I think, sometimes acknowledges this, but especially in her later work from maybe the mid-90s onwards, I think her focus was really on quite high-level epistemic features of our societies, what she variously calls ideologies or myths or worldviews. For example, certain pernicious attitudes towards nature that have become entrenched since at least the time of the Stoics. certain solitary self ideologies that portray us as isolated atomistic creatures, and the varieties of forms of scientism that she was so skilled at critiquing. Now, I think that those high-level epistemic features surely do matter. For example, many forms of arrogance and hubris surely are sustained by these high-level epistemic features. But there should be much more said, I think, about the role of social practices, norms, values, incentive systems, and institutions, ones that can activate and sustain and intensify various of our vices. I mean, vices, we can be pressured into certain vices, we can be rewarded for vicious behavior. But I think Mary makes only brief references to these kind of ground level social features. So in Wickedness, she mentions very briefly at the start of the book cultural factors, bad customs, the absence of anti-aggression norms, certain policies of suppression. But generally, her interests tended to be much more anthropological rather than, if you like, sociological. And we'd want to emphasize these social features, not just because they're important, but also because I think it undercuts some of the optimism she often expresses about our potential to overcome vices. I think that once you tell a fuller story about how the social world is corrupting, you won't be as confident as Mary was that there is, quote, enormous scope for reshaping particular motives. I mean, we'd have to ask which motives she thinks that we can overcome. I mean, if it's the vices that sustain kinds of greed, I think there's relatively little optimism there, because so much of the world tends to feed and reinforce certain kinds of greediness. And once you have this antisocial picture of the world as deeply corrupting, you won't be as optimistic as she was that we can do anything serious about the vices. So there's one thing I'd like her to say more about. And I think that Mary does have the resources to say much more about the social dimensions of the world. There are resources in her work to draw this out. I think it's just that her interest, as it were, was in human nature, and she was thinking in that direction rather than thinking in the more social direction. And my last point, if she did think in the social direction, I think that Mary would find herself far closer than she realizes to a certain kind of misanthropy. Now, I don't mean misanthropy in the dictionary sense of a hatred of humankind. That was not Mary's view at all. Mary was not at all a hater of humankind. But that's only one extreme form of misanthropy. When I use the word misanthropy, I mean it in the modern sense, initiated by David Cooper, where misanthropy is a negative, critical judgment on the collective moral character of humankind. So the philosophical misanthrope sees the human world as infused with a whole range of vices and failings, ones that are deeply entrenched and have now become widespread, ubiquitous within the human world. And I think that Mary was very close to being a misanthrope in that sense. You know, as she says here and there, the vices are not a passing accident due to temporary technical faults in our society. They are rooted in human life. They are abundant and diverse because they're flowing not from this and that social arrangement, they're flowing from, in a sense, what we are as creatures. And as she says, actually, these vices may be worsening over time as our civilization becomes ever more massive and complex. So I think there is a latent misanthropy in a lot of Mary's work, and you see it, I think, in the background of her thinking about the vices. Indeed, like a misanthrope, Mary emphasizes the deep, pervasive discrepancy between human ideals and human conduct. And again, like a misanthrope, Mary warns that human beings have a deep habit of continuous self-deception about our dreadful moral condition, evidence in the distancing devices and the popularity of books by Rutger Bregman and Steven Pinker. And this deep habit of moral self-deception, this turning away from the moral realities of what we are, is, as she says, the main danger facing the human race. And that seems a very portentous way to end a vice theory. So I'll finish there, and I will thank you for listening. Cheers.